Hello and a very warm welcome to today's webinar on supply chain management for operational resilience and where do you start? My name is Tanya Morris and I head up our global partner marketing here at Interos, and I will be your host for today's session. We have a great lineup for the next 45 minutes as we take a deep dive into supply chain management and how, together with the Interos integration into ServiceNow's vendor risk management module, we can help you get started and gain visibility across your vendor and supplier network to make smarter risk and procurement decisions. Now, a few housekeeping notes. Please feel free to ask any questions that you may have in the chat panel. We will do our very best to answer as many of them as possible. And also take a moment to complete the short polls that you will be receiving throughout today's session. Okay, without further ado, let me introduce you to your speakers today from right to left. First and foremost, let's welcome David Decter. David is the partner from Edgile, and he will be kicking off proceedings today. Next, we have Alison Musi, who's the head of the Americas Risk and ECG Solutions Sales. And then last but not least, we have Christian Fernandez. And Christian is the Principal Solution Consultant at Interos. So let's get started. Over to you, David, to kick us off with a review of the supply chain landscape.
From nearly 1,000 organizations surveyed, almost 3/4 of bad deals that required renegotiation could have been prevented with better due diligence. Supply chain disruptions are nearly costing are very costly, and on average, $184 million a year for financial services, and similar but albeit lower numbers for other industries. Insight into the extended enterprise drops precipitously the further out you look as you consider your suppliers and their suppliers, some of which turn out to be competitors or restricted entities at the sovereign level. And lastly, the damage is felt, with 84% suffering real reputational damage from supply chain problems. The news articles are about the main organization, not their supplier, that caused the issue. And so with that setting of the table, on the next slide, want to frame really the landscape. And so as we look at organizations and we see both complex and highly interconnected organizations, on the left hand of this slide is really a summary of how vendors are very much interconnected, and often with major problems of either compromised or insecure suppliers sitting in that ecosystem, as illustrated by the red circles in the bottom right. And while all this is going on, you have tall expectations facing you. And those expectations are summarized in 3 areas. First, maintaining operations while supporting business growth. And that's requiring business impact assessments to be performed, disaster recovery plans, and BC business continuity management plans to be updated, a good understanding of your business services, as well as geographic and cyber risk. The second is around performing supplier due diligence, specifically looking at not only information security and privacy, but also financial, ESG, environmental, social governance, as well as agile sourcing. And the third item is really around managing risk and compliance. So whether it's policy and regulatory compliance, preserving your brand reputation, assessing, rating, and tiering your vendors, negotiating, remediating, and accepting risk, as well as triaging, recovering, and avoiding risk. All this is putting pressure on having an organization with a robust operational resiliency program. On the next slide, we highlight some common challenges that we're seeing. And as we've worked in hundreds of organizations across a diffuse set of industries, what we're seeing is that those BIA assessments aren't performed on a regular basis. The DR and business continuity plans are out of date. There's accuracy and completeness challenges with CMDB. There's unsupported systems and undocumented processes, supply chain dislocations, pandemic and talent challenges to run the programs. On the supplier due diligence front, we're seeing cyber breaches and privacy violations, insolvency and ESG violations, as well as ethics violations, lawsuits, and blocked businesses at a sovereign level. And lastly, from managing risk and compliance, we're seeing that minimum necessary controls are frankly missing. Vulnerabilities are not patched. There's unknown vendors. There's N-tier vendors moving much further out the supply chain. There's suboptimal contracts. And lastly, there's non-compliance, fines, and sanctions. And now, Christian will walk us through how ServiceNow and Interos integration performed and really bring it to life.
Yeah, thanks, David. And ultimately, to be able to achieve the expectations that are thrust upon these teams and enabling a framework like David just walked through, software is at the heart of the ability to drive a process like that. And so one of the things I typically get asked here is, Christian, ServiceNow and Interos seem like they could be competitors, and that actually couldn't be further from the truth. And so we have a slide here to sort of articulate the differences between the two. If you think about ServiceNow in the context of vendor risk management, they're a great solution at the ability to onboard and facilitate a multi-step process to ensure that a vendor meets your internal, playbook and thresholds, like David was just talking about. And I almost consider them sort of like the engine of the process. If you consider Interos, our customers are doing a lot of due diligence work up front and gathering data with immediacy to drive a process like a vendor intake. And so if you want to animate the first part, Tanya, the ability to do vendor due diligence across finance, cyber, ESG, sanctions lists, et cetera, gather that data immediately, and then pass that into a service. Now, you almost think of Interos as the fuel that's driving that engine. And so as you go through the various stages, eventually getting to vendor approval, it enables this notion of active and passive monitoring with Interos incorporated as the continuous monitoring component, where we're monitoring the data for changes. And so this notion of continuous monitoring allows us to develop a life cycle as it can drive additional vendor risk assessments and so forth, as Interos detects new changes to our data set, which in turn drives the vendor risk assessment ratings and so forth. All the while, the other functions within the Interos platform are enabled for teams that might be solely focused on the third-party risk management side of the house, whether it's supplier concentration, looking at financials, bad business practices, geopolitical strife, et cetera. All that's housed within the Interos platform. And so what I'll do now is I'll take a moment to actually walk us through a functional presentation of Interos as well as ServiceNow, such that we can see in real life what that would actually look like. So this is the Interos platform. This is what a user sees when they log in to the system. And if you think about a traditional kind of workflow process where due diligence is being done manually, which is commonly the case, that's being done via surveys. We're sort of having to take the supplier's word of all the data they're giving back to us and having to assess it manually. Interos found that doesn't really work, especially at scale when we're dealing with some of our customers that have 80 to 100,000 suppliers. That model just doesn't work, especially when there are disruptions. And so Interos decided to really flip the whole model on its head, leverage the latest, greatest technology with AI, machine learning, big data to effectively build the world's largest business relationship graph. We have over 350 million entities that are searchable within our database. And as you find one, we'll inform on the risk posture as it relates to the risk factors. And those risk factors are echoed down the middle of the screen here for operations, ESG, cyber, finance, geopolitical, and restrictions. And each of them has their own risk posture, as well as their own relationships and their suppliers that they deal with. And we've been able to consume that data by obtaining things like trade records, bills of lading. We've bought data that inform on digital relationships in front of and behind the firewall, such that we get a risk posture and visibility to their suppliers' suppliers. And so as a result, when a user logs into their instance of Interos, they have this view of their own supply chain ecosystem, which in the upper left tells them, I have a score, an overarching score that tells me the health of this ecosystem, in this case is of low risk, and it categorizes the suppliers into high, medium, low risk automatically. My ecosystem over here on the right-hand side starts with 119 companies, but it explodes out to 415,000 companies across 208 countries because we have this automated ability to understand the relationships from company A to B to C. And that's evidenced by this ecosystem tiers table down below, where I have my tier 1 or my third-party suppliers, tier 2 fourth, and tier 3 fifth. And so we've done all the work. We continue to do the work and expose new relationships from company A to B to C. And as a result, customers have the ability to understand the risk, not only with their direct suppliers, but also risks that might be lying within their tier 2 and tier 3 supplier bases. And so with that as a background, I think the only other thing I'll say as it relates to how we're pulling in data, all of the risk scoring data here is all driven via premium data sources. So things on the financial side, it's Equifax and S&P Global. On the cyber side, it's providers like Risk Recon. So all of this data is being driven to Interos. We're not having to go to a supplier and ask them any questions. We're doing this and getting all this data and giving an outside-in perspective. And we're automating all of it. So this data is continuously streaming in. So while I have visibility to my overarching dashboard and the scores, and I'll drill in a moment to an individual entity, I also have the ability to continuously monitor. So as these scores change, this can, in effect, drive assessments within ServiceNow, which we'll see a little bit later. But as I scroll down here, there's another notion of continuous monitoring that Interos brings to the table. And this is an ability to, outside of the realm of the scoring that we track, the ability to look for disruption and potential disruption events through news. And so we track, thousands and thousands of websites. We ingest and leverage machine learning to understand exactly who is at the center of that article, what topic it falls into, and then associate what tier that actual entity resides in within your ecosystem. So you see some of the last things that happened here in my environment. The last 6 things were non-compliance legal actions, which fall under the ESG category, a labor strike lockout, a cyber attack under cyber, a few labor strike lockouts. And you'll even see we indicate the tier in the lower left of each card, as well as the entity that was affected in the upper right, as well as the article. The whole point here is that we are monitoring each entity within the database. We're listing any events that could potentially disrupt your environment. And to that end, we also have the ability to deliver alerts into a user's inbox. And so this is an example of one that happened, unfortunately, Okta a few months ago. They're an SSO product, had a breach. When I got this alert, it told me that they're a tier 2 supplier in my ecosystem. We informed that there's a intermediary, in this case, a third party, which happened to be Verizon in my example, that was in between, and potentially others. So the idea is I can go start investigating and mitigating this type of an issue here when informed by Interos. In addition, there's a whole notion of the ability to define and be very prescriptive in terms of how I get alerts. And so to that end, I have the ability to say, I want to set up alerts for my ecosystem, let's say, versus critical suppliers. And for critical suppliers, I might do something a little different. Maybe for critical suppliers, I want finance, cyber, operations, ESG restrictions, everything essentially. And for all of them, I want, accidental data spills, everything cyber, maybe just, certain classifications here within the event types. And then maybe at the tier level, maybe it's just tier 1 as an example. So for our customers, it's very simple to set up their subscription settings to the degree that they go in and get very prescriptive alerts. Meanwhile, the whole platform is gathering all the events and aligning them to any of the entities within the database in an automated fashion. So you're not going to miss anything, even if you're not alerted for it, because there's all the events are being recorded, as we see in the middle of the screen here. All right, so that's a quick overview on what the platform is and does. This is intended to be self-service. It's intended to be easy to go ahead and find any entity within the database. So in the upper right, I click search, I type in a company like Intel, and I get a bunch of responses back. I can preview them and understand more about them. I can go view their profile, understand exactly who they are, where they are. I pulled up one for the moment, a company called Twilio that is a technology company based in San Francisco, just as an example. And when I drill into a profile, a couple of things are evident. On the lower right, I'll have all their company information, firmographic details, summary, and in the upper right, an overarching I score. So now this is the overarching score that indicates the health of this entity. And we do our scoring on a very simple 0 to 100, where low is 67 to 100, medium 34 to 66, and 33 and below is considered high risk. Moving forward, the ability to drill in and understand the risk posture relative to each of the 6 risk factors that we track around finance, restrictions, operations, ESG, geopolitical, and cyber. At a high level, I can drill into any of these and understand more. So there's a structure of the overall risk factor. And then within finance, we have this notion of sub-factors. And so sub-factors here at the firm level are getting into things like liquidity categories, profitability, solvency, valuation, and the ability to drill into any of these. So if I'm looking at understanding why their profitability is low, or their capital efficiency, or their debt coverage, I can drill into each of those. But I can also understand that their low risk credit rating is driven here within the screen. And as I scroll down, I can tell you that I'm pulling in the Altman Z and the S&P firm credit score and balancing that against Equifax data. So at Interos, we've done a good job at sort of balancing data from the largest companies in the world to the medium and smaller ones by pulling in someone like Equifax. And of course, on the top end, having S&P global data. So this is just one example of financial insight here. Similar concept on the cyber side with the ability to get into things like data loss. Unfortunately, in the recent past, Twilio in this case has had some issues with data loss, and we record that here. All of this data is being found and ingested into Interos via Risk Recon. So as new things happen, whether it's on the scoring side or by the event side, that scoring data can push new assessments into the ServiceNow environment. Another similar concept in the restrictions area, and restrictions in our world means sanctions lists as well. So that's the term you use, you think of it that way. But we track 23 lists out of the box today. That's the Section 889 list. That's the UN. That's the UK sanctions. The UFLPA, which is a fairly new list we've incorporated into the system. What this 90 reflects on the screen here is 23 separate checks that an end user wouldn't have to go do manually if they wanted to go understand whether or not there was a potential risk related to a sanctions list and this company Twilio. This 90 reflects, hey, they're good here. There's nothing to worry about as it relates to those lists. And so for our users, they find that to be a high efficiency way to sort of understand very quickly at a glance the entire risk profile related to this company, even getting into things like ESG at the firm level, what's driving their 57 social score across these different categories: diversity and rights, sustainability, integration, compensation, community and charity, etc. So we're trying to get a very, very quick and efficient view and have all the data within our customers' fingertips such that they can drive their internal processes more efficiently, but also more broadly and deeply with the data set that we're giving them visibility to. In addition, any events that were driven, we saw this on the homepage relative to the entire database, but in this case, we see a couple of news events in the last few months indicating that Twilio's had some cyber attacks and some mass layoffs. One other element, and I mentioned this on the initial screen, which is that we have this ability to understand who sub-tiers are and what their relationships are within a given entity. And so as our customers choose to do due diligence around any of the entities within, let's say, an initial kind of a proto procurement process, they can actually start investigating any of the relationships that an entity might have. And so as I navigate into the relationships tab for Twilio, I can see their tier 1 suppliers. Right now, this is sorted by iScore, but I could easily flip this to finance and say, are we bringing anyone into our ecosystem, albeit tier 4 or tier 3 rather, tier 2, fourth party, that would be bring undue risk into our ecosystem? And so I could start looking at this and understanding whether or not, and having questions or discussions with Twilio to understand, are any of these high risk financial entities a part of the service or offering that they'll be delivering to us? And we can start having those discussions and understand whether or not there is undue risk that we're bringing in, whether it's cyber, whether it's restrictions, in this case, none, that's great, and then even ESG. And so this gives our customers that visibility that they would typically never get because most suppliers are not going to offer up who their suppliers are, and certainly won't have visibility to their risk visibility and data like this. So let me sort of understand kind of the framework of an individual supplier and how rapidly I can understand every corner of risk relative to a supplier. Again, this is the type of data and fuel that could drive a ServiceNow process. A couple of use cases that are enabled by Interos with this data at the center of it all is the ability to understand on the left-hand side, if I navigate to my restricted connections, I can see at a macro level, who are all the potential restricted companies in my, or who are the restricted companies in my ecosystem from a tier 1 or even a tier 2 perspective. So in this case, we see a number of companies connected to tier 2s and who they connect back through that might be on one-to-many lists. Again, we track 23 lists, sanctions, restrictions lists out of the box, as I mentioned, the latest one being the UFLPA list. In addition, we offer functions that get into things like allowing our customers to understand what is the impact when Russia invaded Ukraine a few months ago. And within a few clicks, they were able to answer that question by going to our geographic concentration view, which was filtered on my ecosystem, so all the companies that I care about, tier 1, 2, and 3, Belarus, Russia, Ukraine. Clicking on this table view here immediately shows me all the entities sorted based on tiers. So I can see I have a number of tier 2s here. I have a number of tier 2 and 3s. So that means there's concentration of multiple tiers. For our customers, the ability to take this list, chunk it down based on industry, hand this off to category managers, and allow them to do their due diligence to understand if any projects were impacted, any services will potentially be disrupted here, and enable any mitigation actions therein. Earlier, I showed that Okta breach email. And for our customers, it's a similar concept, yet a different point of view and visualization to drive mitigation here is the supplier-buyer relationship. So when a breach or an issue happens, I get a notification, I can go to this screen. And what this view is showing us is your company in the middle. Each of these rings represent tier 1, 2, and 3, and each of the bubbles represents a different company or entity within that tier. And so when something like Okta happens, I can search for them within this view here, click on their name, and the user experience will actually show me, okay, Christian, yep, as we showed you, as we know, they're not a tier 1, but they are a tier 2. But which tier 1s are they connected to in your environment? And I can mouse over each of these and see who they are, or again, click a table icon. And here's the short answer. It's these 8 companies I need to perform a mitigation action against, such that I can understand if our data was compromised with any of these 8 providers that are our tier 1s using a company like Okta. And so those are the types of answers we're able to deliver for our customers in fairly short order. Again, all this data that's driving these experiences is akin to the fuel that would drive a ServiceNow workflow. And so I'll take a moment now to jump over to ServiceNow. Focusing in on initially their dashboard point of view, we have an out-of-the-box integration of ServiceNow. It pulls in Interos risk data. To that end, you're able to leverage a dashboard like this that will show us how many Interos companies are being monitored, what the overall average score is, what the distribution between high, medium, and low would be. In this case, it's medium and low. I'm looking at, in this case, my current high-risk area. So it's pointing out things like I have a high cyber score, or high-risk cyber score, high-risk finance scores, et cetera, within a couple of these entities. And at any point, I can drill into, in this example, this Addify company and understand more about them. And so the typical supplier information at the top, but we're weaving in the Interos I score. It's color-coded, similar to what we saw on the Interos side. So it's each of the score values, as well as the level of high, medium, or low for each. What you'll also see down below with the third-party scores section is each of the raw scores and how Interos is pumping in new data here. So as we get a new score, perhaps, let's say the score goes from 40 to 35 as an example overnight, this is the fuel that can then drive an assessment within ServiceNow. And so we'll see an example over here in the lower half: risk reassessment, vendor financial risk change to high. And so this could automate the entire process, such that we showed earlier, where we have that sort of life cycle going from vendor approval back through assessment, enabling that whole active and passive monitoring concept. Thus, I was intending to show from a functional perspective. Tanya, I think I could hand it back to you now, and we can continue on.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. That's great. So what I love about the Interos and ServiceNow integration is really Interos is the insight and some of the intelligence, and ServiceNow really is the platform for action. It really allows us to actually build out those workflows, and that capability, right, to go solve for customer challenges, be it ESG, be it procurement, be it reporting to the regulators. And I think we have one more slide actually that kind of summarizes the importance of operational resilience. Let me just try and build that first. And I think, Christian, do you want to walk us through this before we open up for Q&A?
Happy to. I think, when you kind of summarize all the outcomes, benefits that come along for the ride, when we factor in what David and his team are able to bring from an internal playbook standpoint, rolling that out as best practice, ServiceNow as the engine that's driving it, and Interos is the fuel and the intelligence data. It's really the ability to onboard vendors efficiently and quickly with full visibility to risk. It's really sidestepping any regulatory issues through the restrictions visibility. This whole notion of just automating and mapping and monitoring all these entities on an ongoing basis is kind of handled and done, such that we enable that active passive capability sort of out of the box when we combine ourselves with the ServiceNow. This type of visibility, if we're doing this type of due diligence, it traditionally isn't done to the level of depth of sub-tiers and their risk factors. We have the ability to weed out any potential disruptions down the line. So really the ability to mitigate things faster and proactively, but then also as things happen, and unfortunately they still do, the ability to get on things in the last couple of use cases I showed, whether it was Russia, Ukraine, or that Okta breach. All this is real-time data driven, and so it's not static data, which is the typical model of I'm getting manual surveys, and the moment I get that data back from a supplier, it's old, right? Something could have changed, and so this notion of having it be real time with Interos and ServiceNow is quite different. And so really enabling all lines of business and all the typically sort of siloed areas of procurement, legal, IT, privacy, etc., to leverage one single platform, whether it's Interos, and even ServiceNow, to drive the workflows. So those are some of the major kind of benefits and outcomes we see.
Fantastic. Thank you. Much appreciated. So a big thank you to our presenters from Edgile and also Interos for an enlightening deep dive on the Interos and ServiceNow integration and how customers can get started to achieve the operational resilience and mitigate risk across their supply chains. So now I would like to invite both Alison and Christian to join me, and we'll open up for Q&A. So for those folks on the call, if you've got any questions, please put them in our chat and we'll do our very best to answer them. And I'm just going to change the layout so I can see everyone's lovely faces. I'm going to end the slides. Beautiful. Fantastic. So we have Alison and Christian here in the hot seat. So I'm going to ask a few questions first, just while our audience warms up. So Alison, over to you on this one. We've talked a lot about supply chain resilience, the importance of actually knowing and mapping and monitoring and modeling what's going on in your supply chain. But could you give us some of the advice? I mean, you talk to customers every day. Can you give us some advice on how organizations and companies are starting, the supply chain journey? What's the best bit of advice that you can give them on how to actually start that supply chain risk management journey?
So the advice is not to think of it the same way as we always did, right? I think for a very long time, when we think about managing vendor relationships, supplier relationships, third-party relationships, it was often a check the box exercise, right? Like, did I do my qualitative assessment on a quarterly basis, or did I do it when I first onboarded them? But as we all know, right, the world is changing at such a fast pace, right? You heard them talk about, we have to be worried about cyber attacks. We have to be worried about weather events. We have to be worried about financial, crises, all of these really complicated things. And so the people that start from where they used to do it, I think have a much tougher journey, right? Because you're trying to tweak the program a little bit versus saying, no, what's the outcome I want? How do I build this and think about it from a continuous monitoring and a data-centric approach on how I need to manage the risk and then work backwards, right? Because unfortunately, some of the foundational things that we used to do don't work anymore, right? And it's easy for me to say, being on the supplier side and in highly regulated markets, sometimes you have to continue to do those check the box things, but really looking at it as a transformational exercise and not, oh, well, we always did it this way. How do I just augment my process is where we're seeing people have more challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great answer, right? It's keeping it as simplistic as you can from the start, but data is key, and having that ability to have that continuous insight of that data so you can make those informed decisions is so imperative. And not knowing because you're not knowing is no longer good enough. Yeah, thank you. Christian, anything you'd like to add to that, to Alison's comments?
Yeah, and I love Alison's answer, by the way. I think it's spot on. I would say mine's just slightly different in that my best advice would be to kind of start quickly and you don't have to start huge. It doesn't have to be the whole transformation at once, but if you were able to just deal with like your critical suppliers, right, and get visibility to them in a process like this and see the benefits and the outcomes of a passive versus active monitoring and how that frees up resources to deliver more strategic insights and benefits to the organization. That's what we see our customers enabling. And I would definitely say that's my piece of advice. I'll double down on Alison's piece, though, is when you think about suppliers and having to look at every aspect and not just being a checkbox exercise. A large company can handle a ransomware attack. But if you think of a small supplier getting hit with a ransomware because they have some protocol, that they're not following on their website and they get hacked, and ransomware, that could implode an entire small entity because they can't pay for $100,000 cost of getting, their data back or their customer data back. And so it's insights like that and the ability to sort of sidestep risks related to a supplier, or even inform them that these risks exist within their cyber environment they may not be aware of, that enable a better interaction between supplier and buyer.
Fantastic, thank you. That's really insightful. So, we talk about how do customers get started, and we talked about the importance of actually formulating that risk framework. So, who would like to go first on what that risk framework should look like? I'm going to pick on you, Alison, if that's all right. Give us the fundamentals of what a risk framework should look like.
I think figuring out, well, it's such a tough question, Tanya, honestly. A risk framework is a really big concept, honestly. But I think related to supplier risk, it's figuring out what are those categories that you're worried about the most, right? Mm-hmm. So related to your supplier relationships, is it, and I've seen some of the questions coming into the chat, is it environmental and social? Is it climate risk? Is it the financial disruption? Is it availability of resources, right? For them to be able to produce the goods that you need? Like, what are the risks that you're worried about related to your suppliers? what's your tolerance for them, right? Like, do you have a large tolerance? Is they a critical supplier? Are they a not critical supplier? And then you work backwards, right? For that, from that risk framework to say, how am I now going to measure it, right? Is it something that I can use a data-centric approach? Can I subscribe to an Interos because they have that data set? Or is it something where it's much more the control environment and I'm going to have to go and review their business continuity plans or look at their data centers and still do that more of a qualitative audit-based review of that risk, right? And I think it's not one answer, right? And every industry and your supply or network is going to be a little bit different. But that's where I think Christian walked through many different examples of the different types of data that you can get to collect, to use within your risk framework. But you, being the industry expert, the risk expert at your company, we can't tell you always which risk factors are most important to you. We can walk you through an exercise and talk to you about how peers of yours might do it. But it really is a little bit unique depending on what industry and what your supplier network looks like, right? So it may actually be good to answer one of the questions that came through, honestly, because it was about data. Christian, this is for you. Somebody had asked, there's been a big shift in the focus of ESG and climate risks. You mentioned being able to monitor financial data. Do you monitor similar data sources in other categories? And I think that kind of gets at the risk framework, right, too.
It certainly does.
Agreed.
Right? Yeah. So, to answer the question, our data is cyber, ESG, finance, geopolitical, operations, and restrictions. So, and we leverage premium data sources to drive each of those. So this isn't Interos making this stuff up. We've gone out to the marketplace and said, what is the best possible data that we could leverage and buy, aggregate into a single point of view for 350 million entities and inform on their individual risk posture on those risks, and then the sub-factors and then the attributes that are driving those. And so hopefully that answers the question in the chat. I think if we think about, how we enable a risk framework, I'm kind of old school. I've been doing this for a while, and I think it relies on three things. It's the people, process, and technology. And certainly there are steps to it. We didn't cover this today, but there is a notion of a maturity model. And this relates to any type of software, typically with people, process, and technology. But in this realm, it kind of goes back to my first answer, starting small. Can we get visibility to the critical suppliers that if these things go down or happen, something bad happens with them, they disrupt the business in a major way? If I can just get insight there and have some assessment processes developed and workflows around it with best practice, active, passive monitoring, customers see the value quickly and then have the ability to start moving into other areas of the maturity model by leveraging more of a ServiceNow, by leveraging additional use cases, adding more suppliers to a ServiceNow, so we get greater visibility and more benefit of the automation that these systems and processes together enable.
Fantastic. Great answer there. Great answer. So I just want to expand on organizations that are actually getting this right. Organizations that are actually taking charge of the operational resilience when it comes to their supply chain, where they're able to preempt risk and mitigate risk. What kind of benefits are those organizations actually reaping from that kind of investment? And Christian, I'm going to throw that one at you, if that's okay.
I'm sorry, I have to repeat that. I didn't quite understand.
Yeah, so no, it's fine. So the organizations have actually invested, and the customers, that have invested, and they're on top of their supply chain resilience. What kind of benefits are they actually reaping from that investment?
Yeah, it's the efficiency, one, from an onboarding standpoint. It's the depth and breadth of data now that they have. It's even the ability, holding their suppliers to account with this data and having, I think, just more streamlined conversations with them and becoming partners. It doesn't have to be so adversarial that I have this data on you and now you're going to have to, I'm not going to do business with you. That's not the case in a lot of cases. We have the ability to have these discussions and have informed discussions for our customers. So I think it's that. I think it's also being able to move their resources out of typically manual processes and ones that are more targeted and surgical and then ones are more strategic in general. I think that the business sees benefit from that overall.
Fantastic.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I was going to add, we
Yeah.
had a luncheon down in Charlotte, right, with Jennifer, your CEO, and we had a bunch of financial services customers with us last week, and we were chatting about the same topic. And a lot of the benefit, right, is one of the risks we're all dealing with, not supply chain risk, is people risk, right? People want to be doing meaningful work and aren't afraid to be leaving companies, right? And I think a lot of supply chain work and vendor work can be manual. It's a lot of data collection to get to the point where you get to do analysis to actually fix the problems, right? I think when you look to automation like ServiceNow and Interos and have them be working together, where you're actually automating a lot of the data collection, automating a lot of the low fun work, I should say. I'm using the wrong words, but the work that isn't what people want to be doing, it actually elevates people's jobs, right? And yes, you're solving the problems faster, you're mitigating risk for the organization, but you now have people on your team that can actually be engaged in creating those partnerships that Christian mentioned, leaning in to solve really important problems, right? So that the business can be more predictable, right? Like supply chain disruptions have real world implications, right? And financial impacts to our organizations. And the only people that can truly solve them are our employees. But they can't do that, and they're not freed up to go do that unless we bring automation and collect the data for them to go make these really important decisions that you don't want AI and machine learning to do. You want people to be making those decisions. And so I think that's a lot of the benefits that we hear from people is that more meaningful work.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. One question I just saw that's come through. This one's for you, Christian, actually. How can the integration with ServiceNow, how can this help me address some of the regulation requirements for the supply chain? We're getting more and more, right? You've got the German Supply Chain Act, you've got potentially DORA hitting on cyber, you even got the New York Fashion, Supply Chain Act. Any thoughts on that, please, Christian?
Yeah,
putting you in the hot seat again.
Yeah, of course, happy to be. I mean, ultimately, with our approach towards just receiving data and being able to enable data changes, which would then in turn enable workflow in a ServiceNow, we're sort of at the tip of the spear where we're receiving this data and enabling change within a ServiceNow. And so the ability to enable workflows that are unique to each type of regulation that we may care about or may have to follow, whether it's a DORA, German Supply Chain Act, what have you, we can have predefined workflows within ServiceNow that would handle those things. So as a score changes relative to a type, that could initiate a change in ServiceNow that would allow us to mitigate and assess accordingly.
Yeah. I would add a little bit more to that, right? I think the integration we showed today was a lot more around just like pulling the vendor scores in. But there's a lot more to it, right? ServiceNow has the integrated risk management side of managing the life cycle of your suppliers, which means your supplier policies. It means the regulatory library, where you're actually pulling in all of those global regulations that you're holding your suppliers to, right? That they need to comply with, the controls associated with it. And then that links up to the data collection side, right? But now I can have dashboards and I can have reports related to all of my suppliers that are affected by the German rules, or all of my suppliers that are affected by, the new, retail regulations around suppliers. So it allows you to better integrate these siloed programs. A lot of times in firms, you've got people that handle the policy. You've got the people that handle the controls. Then you've got the supplier, team that's initiating those relationships, and the systems don't all talk to each other. When you integrate them all together, it's seamless, right? And you get the transparency and visibility regardless of the person that needs to see it. The way that the person needs to see it in one country might be a little bit different than the other. And it also allows you to be more dynamic. Am I watching the regulatory changes that are affecting my suppliers, right? Am I modifying the controls? Am I modifying the policies in real time, right, to make sure that we're meeting those changing requirements. I don't know, David, this is where you may actually have some good insights that you want to add.
Yeah, so we're seeing that, clearly there's a need for rapid due diligence upfront, and it really points to some of those statistics that we shared where we could have avoided a lot of bad deals that had to be renegotiated had we had more rapid information upfront. So feeding that information in, but then really we also need that active piece where we need to interact, run the workflows. ServiceNow's vendor portal is the most robust in the industry and provides a great user experience for the supply chain to then interact with your organization, follow up, triage some of the issues that may come up, and really pull this all together. I guess further, we're able to tick and tie and pull in the IRM pieces and the regulatory regimes and mandates, pull in risk acceptance, manage those, and then follow up and interact in a professional way with the business about the risks that they are taking as they onboard these vendors and really understand that. I think further the power of the CMDB and business continuity to then proactively start to triage and remediate some of these exposures that come up in your supply chain really starts to bring it all together. And so that's where we're really seeing a lot of value from with the clients, that they're able to effectively do a lot more with less, automate the workflows, give great reports, and then automate some of the escalation and trigger and triage that's required.
Fantastic. Thank you, David. So I'm very conscious we're nearly at time. I'm just going to do a very quick round robin to see if any closing thoughts. So ladies first. Alison, any closing thoughts for you on operational resilience?
Just the closing. I was going to say just the closing thought that it's an ecosystem, right? Like this is why these partnerships are so important to ServiceNow, right? While we can help be that system of action across your supply chain life cycle, it's working with these amazing new technologies like Interos, right, to be able to pull all of that information together for the people that are doing the work, right? You don't want people to be swivel chairing from one screen to the next and not understanding the business context. And so I would just say, when you're really looking to solve for this, look at the whole ecosystem, right, and figure out how do you make the work easier to do, because these problems are not going away. They just continue to get to be larger challenges. And if we help solve the systemic issue of how we kind of look at managing the whole thing, then when the things are changing in the environment, you can just insert that new resource right into the process to allow you to be more flexible and adapt to those changes.
Fantastic. Great answer. Great comments. Christian, any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, I would just say to anyone out there, just, free yourself, at least try to have the manual, typical approach towards this stuff, and just look at the ability to automate and how that enables you and your team to just be more strategic and do, frankly, more interesting work, and that's work that's beneficial to the overall organization.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And David, any thoughts from you?
Yeah, I guess what I'm seeing, and I'm often asked, is it Interos or ServiceNow? And that's the wrong question. The question should be, how are we getting both that continuous monitoring and that kind of passive input of the data more efficiently and effectively? And then how am I better able to have the hard conversations with my management team around my risks and exposures, workflow that out, and really manage the problem through ServiceNow. So it's really, you need both.
Fantastic. Thank you. Well, that concludes our session today. So a big thank you to our speakers and our presenters today, Alison, David, Christian. Really appreciate it. For the folks on the call, please take a moment to complete the poll. That should be appearing on your screens very shortly. And if Interos and ServiceNow and Edgile can help you in any way to get started on your supply chain operational resilience, you know where we are. So thank you very much for your time. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.